The Pac-12 is on life support right now, and they're finally going to tell us what their media rights deal is. You heard Bogusch mention that. We finally have an announcement coming on their media rights deal. But it speaks to the status of this conference right now that Colorado is exiting for the Big 12. And I don't think anybody would argue with that decision. I know we played that clip from Dan Lanning, who is the head coach at Oregon, who was taking a shot at Colorado. What have they ever won? And it's true. Since they entered the Pac-12, they've been a disaster. One season they were good. Everything else has been an absolute nightmare in the Pac-12. But it's less to do about what they won in the Pac-12 and where the shifting plate tectonics of college football and college athletics are going. And I don't blame Colorado for trying to get to high ground, because Colorado exists in that ether where you'd rather be ahead of the game than left behind. There was this concern for years, and I guess there still might be a concern, that perhaps there's eventually going to be just a league of the power schools, a power conference, a super conference of 64 to 68 schools, and they would hold their own tournaments. They would hold their own college football playoff, and they would hold their own NCAA tournament. And ultimately, they would shut out and shun everybody else because they'd rather govern themselves than have to deal with other institutions along with them. And that power, that super conference would not include likely schools like Colorado. So you can understand, I can understand why Colorado would try to get to the high ground, a more stable conference. What this says, though, for Colorado and for the Pac-12 is very notable in that they are running back to a conference that they left because they thought the Big 12 was the low ground. And they thought at one time the Pac-12 was the high ground. And so Colorado might not factor into winning national championships in basketball or football. They might not win the Big 12 championship. They might not be in the college football playoff. You might not pay attention to Colorado athletics much, except Dion is there now, so maybe you pay attention to that. But it's interesting because Colorado is the ultimate litmus test. Colorado is the test. And that is 12 years ago, leaving the Big 12 for the Pac-12 was the right move. You were leaving a conference whose epicenter was Texas, and that the Longhorns got the long end of the stick, as most member institutions felt about the Big 12, and that everybody else got screwed, and that it was the Longhorns and everybody else, and that eventually you didn't want to be wrapped into a conference that was about Texas and Oklahoma and nobody else. And so for Colorado, going to the Pac-12 was geographically a good enough fit. They would break all of those old rivalries in the Big 12, but going to the Pac-12 was stability. And it had USC and UCLA. Oregon had become a powerhouse. And the Pac-12 had some juice to it, had some buzz to it. And you knew you could go there and be linked to the Rose Bowl and linked to these massive historical institutions. And maybe you felt a little bit more like-minded with their academic pursuits or whatever. And the Colorado felt like that's the right move. And nobody really argued with that move at that time, unless you argued against the history of the Big 8 to the Big 12, of which Colorado was part of it. But other than history, I don't think financially you could have argued with going to the Pac-12. Today, the exact opposite. As USC and UCLA flee for the Big 10, the Big 12, which was left for dead 5 years ago, has rebounded mightily. And because the Big 12 had forward-thinking leadership who said the moment that Texas and Oklahoma left, we're not going to stand still. We've got to have our plan in place, Plan B. Who knows if they had that Plan B already in place, Maybe all these conferences already know about the schools they would bring in if something like that happened. But it certainly didn't take long for the Big 12 to say, okay, we lost those 2 schools. We're going boom, 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 boom. Those 4 we're bringing in. UCF, Houston, BYU, and I'm forgetting one more, but Cincinnati. And so then they collect that next tier of schools. They bring those in. And by being proactive and aggressive, they signed a new media rights deal. And they did so with this thought in mind, which I thought was very smart. Instead of chasing the Amazon dollars, the Apple Plus dollars, the Google dollars, the YouTube dollars, the high-tech world dollars, let's stay in places where everybody watches our games. ESPN and Fox. And that's what the Big 12 did. They looked at 2 places that they've been on before, 2 places that college football fans still watch games by the boatload at, and said, we're going to stay. And we're not going to chase the last dollar from Apple Plus and risk people not finding us. Let's stay where people find us. It's visible, and we'll get promotion. Because if you're on ESPN, guess what? They're probably going to talk about you during game day. If you're on Fox at night or in the afternoon, that game's probably going to be talked about with the Sunday kickoff. Big noon kickoff. It's a smart business plan. So the Big 12 made smart decisions. And today, seeing that the Big 12 got the money and the Pac-12 didn't, and that the Big 12 lost its 2 big schools but brought in 4 good ones, maybe not great, but good ones, and the Pac-12 doesn't have answers. Is it San Diego State? Is it not? Is there any good answer out there? Fleeing to the Big 12 looks like the right move today for Colorado. And because of it, I don't know where that leaves the Pac-12. I can tell you 5 years ago I thought the Big 12 was over. So I had written the epilogue to their story. I had etched the tombstone of the Big 12, and they survived, and they're doing very well, thank you. So perhaps the Pac-12 can do the same thing. The issue is when you start trying to pluck schools to replace UCLA and USC, it's hard because there's only so many schools. It's not like you could just bring up the next rung in your prospect farm system like the Big 12 did. Once you took out Central Florida, Houston, BYU, and Cincinnati out of the mix, and you're the Pac-12, what's your next 4 schools? Boise State, San Diego State, Nevada, UNLV. Are you going to dip into the Sun Belt schools? Are you going to dip into the MAC schools? Are you going to dip into the Conference USA? Are you going to dip into the American? There's not great options for the Pac-12. And that's kind of a finite number of schools that would work anyway to still make you feel like a power conference. Plus, behind Larry Scott, the Pac-12 drove itself into a wall. Larry Scott was a disaster as a commissioner. Scott kept saying how big and bold the Pac-12 was going to be, and he just kept putting them behind the 8 ball with a absolutely disgraceful media rights deal, of which there was Pac-12 networks, most of which were digital, which what does that even mean? You might as well be on ESPN Plus or whatever. And secondly, they had to get their offices in the Bay Area and these gleaming, beautiful building in which they paid out of their you-know-what for rent and put themselves behind the financial 8 ball there. And then they watched UCLA and USC go elsewhere and didn't have an immediate reaction to it like the Big 12 did. And now they're just trying to keep everybody in-house happy without a real game plan. And they had to take the secondary options on the media market for their TV rights. And they keep pushing it off, because apparently at one point their new commissioner, Kliavkoff, wanted $50 million a year per institution, which is Big Ten money, which is a joke because they would never get it for games between Oregon State and Arizona State. Like, that's not going to command Big Ten money. And once you lose USC and UCLA, the school to pay attention to is Oregon, and then, the nation kind of wakes up if you're in a Pac-12 championship game. There's not a lot there that you've got to watch. So between Scott and Kliavkoff, they totally busted here. And if you're Colorado, of course you would want to leave if you got an invite to the Big 12. The Big 12 is more stable. So I'm not going to put the toe tag on the Pac-12 yet because we've seen the Big 12 come back from the dead. But how the Pac-12 stays alive, you tell me. Who are the schools that you would acquire, that make you still feel like a relevant power conference? They're not really out there. And then you have to match up academic, I suppose, if you want to do that. I mean, the Pac-12 is a series of very good academic schools, and so that has hurt Boise State, according to a lot of people around this type of realignment, that you're trying to find like-minded academic institutions. Maybe the Pac-12 doesn't do that anymore, but, signing UNLV is not because UNLV feels like Stanford. It's that UNLV is in Las Vegas and you're just hoping to get into that market. I don't know what this media rights deal is going to look like, but I can tell you this. I don't sense that there's a very easy fix for the series of bad decisions the Pac-12 has made.